All right, it's 7:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And welcome everyone. My name is Cheryl Hill, and I'm an adult services librarian at the Westland Public Library. I believe we have some people watching from outside the area. So really quick, I'll tell you that we are a public library in Westland, Oregon, which is a community of about 26,000 people in the suburbs of Portland. We have been closed since last March, but for all of you locals who haven't yet heard, we began phase 1 reopening today. At this point, you can just come in the library to pick up your holds. We don't have dates yet, but at some point we will allow browsing and computer use, so stay tuned for that. I'll put a link in the chat box with information about our reopening. For those of you on YouTube, you'll find that link in the video description. So welcome everybody to Vegetable Gardening for Beginners, presented by Master Gardener Kris LaMar. This program is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. Some of you are watching this via Zoom, and because we reached our 100-person registration limit on Zoom, many of you are watching the live stream on YouTube. If you are on Zoom, please make sure you are muted. Zoom watchers can also type their questions in the chat box at any time. I wanted to let you know about 2 upcoming events that the library is presenting. Tonight's presenter will also be doing Houseplants 101 on Monday, April 12th at 7 p.m. Like this program, it will be virtual. And then on Thursday, April 29th at 6 p.m., we have an online workshop called Making the Most of Your 401k. If you're interested in registering for those programs, I'll put the link in the chat box. And for those of you on YouTube, you'll find that link in the video description. That's enough from me, and I will turn this over to Kris.
You're going to have to tell me when I'm live, because I didn't see it.
You are live and you're ready to go.
Okay. Thank all of you who have taken some time out of your Monday evening on the Ides of March, always a problematic day if you spend any time studying Roman history. But in some respects, vegetable gardening is where it all began, probably not in the Garden of Eden, but certainly in the Garden of Eating. And one of the ways that we can all become more self-reliant and take control over our consumption, our use of packaging, etc., is to learn how to grow our own foods. One of the drawbacks of Zoom presentations as opposed to face-to-face teaching and learning opportunities is that I don't have a lot of information about the extent to which each of you has a history of any vegetable gardening or any other kind of gardening for that matter, what your interest is, what your vocabulary is. And so I kind of have to give a presentation to an audience blind. I will say that some questions came in for those of you who registered earlier, and those have been very helpful for me, and I've actually changed my PowerPoint presentation to address some of those specific questions. So just as you, I'm sure, have concerns about produce and other foodstuffs that go to waste in the commercial world, one of the things that you want to think about before you put any seed in any soil of any type is to recognize that you need to know what you're going to want to put time and energy and to some extent money in. So it might be helpful when we're just at the cusp of being able to do something to grow our own food, that you think back about what produce you have purchased either at a grocery store or a farmer's market, because food going to waste is not something that the Extension Service or I suspect anybody else wants to promote. Some crops look really beautiful on the seed packets, but if it's a crop that you have never eaten, you're not sure whether you'd like it or not, I'd suggest to you that at least as an early nation gardener, that you don't plant something that you're not certain that it will appeal to someone. And don't plant more of a crop as you're planting your garden than you, your family, and friends will consume. And I know from personal experience that trying to foist off an overabundance of zucchini on my friends and neighbors is something that was not particularly helpful. Also, consider succession planting. I'm going to talk about this a little later, but you don't have to pick just one crop for one area of your garden. You can actually maximize the space, whether it's containers or raised bed gardens or gardens in native soil, so that you can extend your season. And typically, you would start out right now, for example, by growing cool weather crops and save the hot weather crops, and I'll talk in a minute just exactly what those are, for later in the season. So you can use the same space for a succession of different crops. So where should you put your garden? And this is something that is very unique to every single gardener. The picture that I've put here of the gardens in Asia are probably not something that you want to emulate unless you've decided that you want to grow rice. Rice paddies and other plants that are grown entirely in watery bases are few and far between, and as much water as we have here in the Pacific Northwest, that creates more problems than it's going to solve. So the first thing you need to think about is my garden space going to get 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day? Now, obviously, that changes between the seasons, but for plants that have the need to have the most sunlight and direct sunlight, that may even be 8 to 10 hours a day, particularly for crops like corn and those that create fruits. Drop a footnote. The difference between a fruit and a vegetable plant is really not one that's scientific, except that if a plant produces an edible fruit, and this includes nuts, then we call it a fruit. But some vegetables, although they produce, some plants, as long as they produce seeds and flowers, that doesn't mean that we eat them. Think, for example, of celery or even carrots. You probably eat celery seeds, but it's a vegetable because you're eating a part of the plant that's not a flower or a nut. And of course, having available water. There's just nothing like trudging half a mile, taking God knows how many containers to water a garden. So you have to think initially of how available will my garden be when I'm tired and hot and don't particularly feel like being an extraordinary gardener that day. But the other side of water is that there needs to be good drainage. A garden that sits in water, is the one that you see here in this picture, is pretty dramatic. We don't have many of those here, but many plants in the Pacific Northwest are especially susceptible to microbes. Those are tiny little live bacteria and fungi, for example, that readily take over and can kill plants. And that happens primarily where there's standing water. South facing would be the ideal way to site your garden. And you'd want to think about putting the taller plants on the north so that they're not shading the plants on the south that need to maximize their exposure to the sun. Don't plant your plants plan your garden in an air sinkhole at the bottom of a hill, because as we know, hot air rises, cold air sinks, and many plants need very warm temperatures if they're going to be maximized in their growth patterns. And finally, easily accessible. If you have to climb up many stairs or other kinds of impediments, you're probably going to turn down the opportunity to take care of your plant, either in terms of weeding or watering, or just taking care of it by harvesting it. So you need to find some place that you can get to easily. Some of you ask questions about how to make sure that you're not going to get the four-legged variety of pests in your garden. And you need to think about this before you lay out the garden. So you may require fences to keep out deer, raccoons, and other mammals. Your neighbors may not be too pleased if you have compost heaps that attract those type of animals, and they decide they're going to eat fresh food close to your compost heaps. That's an entirely different subject, but you may have to bury chicken mesh under your garden, which will prevent the burrowing animals from coming up. And there are actually some type of burrowing animals that can suck down the root of the plant, and it was there last night and it's gone this morning. You may have some plants that I'm not going to cover, but some of the berries, blueberries, blackberries, etc., that are attractive to birds, and you might want to think about putting netting over those garden areas, but you don't want the netting to be screened so tightly that pollinators cannot get in to help form the fruits for your plants. And finally, and this is probably should be in all caps, don't use any pesticides, whether it's for the four-legged or the insect variety, without first reading the label, because many of these are not approved for use in vegetable gardens. And people tend just to spray them on at the wrong time of the day, the wrong season, and they can become hazardous not only to the two-legged animals in the area, but can kill everything in the garden. And you might want to write down that the National Pesticide Control Center, which is located in Eugene, is a great resource to consult. They have a great website, and you can get information from that office from 9 to noon every day. Let me talk about some definitions, because especially for new gardeners, if you don't understand how all of these systems work together, because you don't really haven't been exposed to some of the terminology, you can end up over fertilizing or under fertilizing or using the wrong kind of fertilizer for the crop that you intend to grow. So fertilizers are man-made combinations of nutrients. And you can look on the front of fertilizers, both chemically produced and organic fertilizers. I'll get to that in just a second. And you'll see three numbers there. The first number, and these are in alphabetical order, first number is nitrogen. Nitrogen promotes the growth of foliage, so leaves. Phosphorus is the second number. These are alphabetical. Phosphorus promotes the growth of healthy roots. And potassium's critical for a plant that is producing flowers, seeds, and nuts. For those of you who have houseplants, you may have looked at these numbers. Well, inside, most of our flowering, or our indoor plants are not flowering, and so you'd want to concentrate on having the higher number of nitrogen. But outside, it varies widely among the various species of plants, and it's helpful to do some research before planting them so that you plant plants in the same general area and you can fertilize them in the same way. Nutrients are chemicals, and you see the periodic table of elements up at the top. Probably some of you haven't looked at that since chemistry in high school, and you don't have to memorize it, but there are the three major macronutrients that I just talked about, and then there are 13 other ones that are called micronutrients, and they're needed in very small quantities. You typically don't have to add them. You don't even have to worry about them. If you start seeing problems in your plant's leaves, etc., that may be what the critical element is. And then we have the three building blocks: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbohydrate means that you have a carbon, at least one carbon atom, at least one hydrogen atom, and oxygen, the ATE, you have oxygen in it. So carbohydrates are produced because the sun, along with chlorophyll, helps to create these really critical parts of the plant. Organic fertilizers are made from plant-based material rather than chemical manufacture, and they're mostly carbon. And some of you ask about using red wiggler worms in a worm bin, and those are just wonderful for providing free organic fertilizer through their castings or poop. And they live in and are actually the active part of compost. But you're going to go probably into a gardening center and you're going to see a whole variety of things that you can use that act as the places where the plant's roots will grow. Seed starting soil is very, very fine soil. Does not have many, if any, added nutrients to it. And because it is so fine, the new roots of the plants are able to establish themselves in this medium. It's also sterile so that you don't have bacteria and fungi and nematodes and the host of other microbes that can become problems for plants. And it's lighter. It's typically mostly made up of peat moss. Now, potting soil is again a human created mixture. It's also organic material such as peat moss, but it may have added nutrients to it. And again, you can look at a bag or whatever the container is of potting soil and see whether it has any of these three macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but it may have iron, etc. And the micronutrients alphabetically go from boron to zinc. Now, those of us in the Pacific Northwest who are vegetable gardeners and probably every other kind of gardener have three things to curse. One is clay, one is slugs, and the other is funguses. And one of the great probably advances in horticulture and vegetable gardening is that the potting soil that we have available does have the ability to have added nutrients, typically organic nutrients added to it. But this is a question that several of you had and that we get a lot at the extension office is, can I reuse potting soil year after year if I have it in a container or perhaps even in raised bed gardens? And one of the problems with potting soil is that over several years, it may in fact lose the nutrients in it, and you have to figure out how you're going to replenish them. So if you're looking at a container or an area that's already had a garden in it, one of the things that you need to ask is, does this need to have supplemental nutrients added to it? Seed packets can be very, very helpful in helping you make decisions about what you want to grow in your garden. If you've settled on the general species, but you're not exactly sure whether you want to try this particular variety. And as you can see on the left side of this screen, there's a lot of information on the back of the seed catalogs. You may be more attracted to the front of it, but that's just to entice you to pick up the seed packet. You need to turn it to the back to see exactly what you're going to get if you plant it. This packet, for example, was packed for 2015. That meant that in 2015, close to 100% of the seeds there will germinate and be viable. This goes down by about 20% every year. So by 2015, very few of the seeds in that packet will be viable. So you're not going to get any plants out of them. And the way to tell whether these old ones are that somebody may have saved at some point, whether they're still viable, is just to try to germinate a few and see if you get any plants growing out of them. Then you have the English and Latin names. The packet should tell you a description of what the plant size will be, and the size of the fruit if it is a fruit producing plant. It'll also have a map of the United States, and what this will tell you is, in general, the USDA zones, and if you look at this and know anything about the topography and the seasons in the United States, the blue states are the ones that have longer winter seasons. And plants are very susceptible to the temperature of the soil, not so much the ambient temperature of the atmosphere, but when they're growing their roots after germination, many of them will die off simply because the soil is too cold. This will also, and this is a great packet, shows you the amount of sun, the water, the depth of seed into the soil, and the spacing of plants in the garden. And then how long you can expect from the time that you plant the seed to when it will germinate, and then when it will be ready to harvest. Some packets may tell you whether this is an organic seed that is produced without artificial chemicals, and information about the distributor. Be sure you read them. Many of you submitted questions in advance about how you know whether you should and can start plants inside or whether you should plant them directly. And I'm going to show you quite a bit information relevant to this in just a second. But if you think of certainly 10 years ago, you couldn't find things like carrots that you could buy in a garden center and take home and plant in the garden. They've tried that successfully. They're available now. But particularly the root vegetables are more successfully planted directly into the ground when the soil is warm enough, rather than trying to get them from an inside environment and then transplanting them into the garden. And in many cases, it's just because you're disturbing the roots. It's almost impossible not to lose some of the soil that was around the plant when the seeds started germinating. But other species are best started in a warm, controlled environment. Many of you have probably tried, at least if you've dipped your toe in at all, to start tomatoes and peppers indoors and then to plant them outside, hopefully waiting until the soil is appropriately warm. Most seed packets tell you how deep to plant the seed, but not whether it's from seed or to be transplanted. And I'm going to give you some more information about how you can find that out. Remember that the smaller the seed, the closer it needs to be to the top of the soil. Seeds essentially are just little backpacks. They carry enough food for the plant for the seed to become a plant in two ways. First, it sends down a root, and second, it sends up a stem. And if that seed is so far down into the ground that there's not enough food, carbohydrates, for the plant to get above this first stem above ground and start forming its leaves, it's not going to be able to photosynthesize to feed itself. And plants are remarkably able to feed themselves through the process of photosynthesis. And again, based on what we know about how the successful gardeners go in vegetable gardening, many novice gardeners transplant too early because the soil isn't warm enough or doesn't drain well enough. Now, I'm going to cover a lot of information, but if you write down nothing else during the course of this, please write down and access the Growing Your Own, which is a publication of Oregon State University. I don't know how many pages it is, but you don't have to worry about a publication itself because it's available in PDF at this website. It has everything, covers everything that I'm going to talk about and a whole bunch more things, but you don't have to commit much of this to memory. I'm just trying to give you kind of the parameters of vegetable gardening, and you can go into some of the more important scientific knowledge that you need to have in this publication. It's free. In this publication, and apropos to when to plant, transplant, etc., you'll see the graph, the chart that's on the right-hand side. And you can't see it very well, and I'm going to blow it up in the next slide, but it has all of the more typical, commonly found vegetables in the Pacific Northwest, all the way from artichokes to watermelons. On the left-hand side, you'll see that I have a picture of a soil temperature thermometer. Now, I suppose if you had too many of them in your house, in your kitchen, you could probably use a kitchen one, but this only goes up to 180. I'll guarantee you that even with global warming, if we get up to 180, you have other things to worry about than vegetable gardening. But what you can do is to go out in your probably native soil, so the soil that surrounds your house, not necessarily container gardenings, and see what the soil temperature is. The chart, I hope this is a little easier. This chart has various zones in Oregon. You can see there's the Oregon coast, the valleys, plateaus, and then Eastern Oregon. And so you identify what area of the state that you live in, and it will tell you whether it is suitable to, for example, in the second column, whether you can start them indoors, or and if it says not suitable, that means they need to be direct seeded right into the soil, or a raised bed garden or container gardening. And then it gives you the information, as you can see, about the amount to plant for a family of 4. If you don't think that your family would eat that much, or you're 1 or 2 people, then you obviously wouldn't want to plant, for example, 10 to 15 cauliflower plants. The next column, the distance between rows, is very important because it gives you information, although it doesn't exactly say it, about how large the mature plants will be. One of the other mistakes that new vegetable gardeners make is that they plant plants too close to each other, and then they compete with each other for root space, they compete with each other for sunlight, and they compete with each other for water and nutrients in the soil. So it may look like you have a naked garden when you start out, but I assure you that if you leave this kind of room between your plants, regardless of how they got into the soil, you will have healthier and more productive plants. And then the last column is the distance apart in the rows. This is true, this applies to not only the same plant varieties and species, but also keeping them away from some other plant species and varieties so that they aren't competing with them as well. Now, if you have decided that you want to try to germinate seeds inside, and that chart that I just showed you indicates that you can start them inside, here are some of the rules. And again, these are all included in Growing Your Own, the publication. The temperatures should, until they are ready for transplant, be kept between 65 and 75 degrees. And that's probably not a temperature that you would want your house to be most of the time. So you might want to try to find a designated closet or other space. You don't have to have any external light because you need to have full spectrum light. Grow lights provide this. You need to make sure that they're full spectrum lights. Full spectrum means that they have all the way from ultraviolet to infrared, ultraviolet at the top, infrared at the bottom, which is what sunlight contains. And most of our windows now have film on them you don't see that keeps out the ultraviolet and the infrared lights. So you have to pretend that your plant is in the sunlight and provide conditions that emulate that. The soil needs to be loose, well draining, which is why the seed starting soil is good, but don't let the soil dry out. The 2 worst things that you can do to a baby plant is to let the soil dry out, because then the roots are all surrounded by air and they really have to have water on them, but not too much water, which is why it needs to be well draining. If they dry out, you're going to have a dead seedling in a matter of hours. Once established, that is, once you have, and you can see the picture here, the seed is actually has been pushed up by the stem and is on top of the 2, in all of these plants, the 2 leaves. They're called seed leaves, and they're the ones that provide for the photosynthesis initially before the other leaves branch out. But once you see that the seed leaves have been supplemented by the true leaves, then you can start to think about putting them outside, but don't do it certainly overnight. And you need to make sure that the day temperatures are over 50. So put them in some kind of a planting container that you can bring back in at night. If it gets below freezing, they're toast. And some plants, even getting down to 40 degrees at night, will not survive the episode. To keep roots from competing with each other, you need to thin them. And remember to go back to the chart to see how far apart they should be. If you're growing each of them, one thing that you might want to consider is growing them in the cardboard egg cartons, and then you can cut them up and transplant them the 12 or 36 or however many inches apart in your garden or in your containers. And you don't disturb the roots because you can put that cardboard right into the soil. It'll decompose and it'll hold the root and the soil together until the plant is able to establish true roots. One of the things that you need to think about when you're thinning these, though, is that you've got two nascent seedling starts, and you pull one out with your fingers or something else that grabs them. Well, you're probably likely to pull out the other one, or at least to disturb its roots. So rather than doing that, use some sharp scissors, such as manicure scissors, until you're down to one seedling. You can eat what you cut, hopefully cut rather than pull. You can eat that. We call them microgreens. They're wonderful on salads. You can also try to germinate your plants using seed tapes and do-it-yourself planters for seeds. Seed tapes, you just use toilet paper. They're great instructions on the internet for this. This isn't very scientific, but you don't want the seeds to be any closer than 2 inches apart. Then you fold them over. Use something like Elmer's glue. You don't want to use any kind of really heavy duty glue. You just want it to hold together for a while. You can also make seed starting containers from toilet paper rolls, and much like the egg cartons made of cardboard, you can plant them right into the soil. Just be sure that you, regardless of what container you're using, you label the seed tapes with the name of the plant, because for a long time, until they get to be sometimes 4 to 6 inches tall, they're all going to look like baby plants that you don't exactly know what you're planting. And crayons or wax pencils won't dissolve in water. You can always also put them next to the plant when you put it into the garden, but labeling the container itself is the best bet. Then, from what you read in Growing Your Own or learn on the seed package, how tall and wide will the plant be? Again, this is important for planting them so that they are getting appropriate water, sun, nutrients, etc. Plant for the mature size, not the seedlings. The fact that they're close to each other is not a good idea, but you'll think, oh, I'm never going to get any vegetables unless I just cover this area as thoroughly as I can with plants, and that's absolutely the wrong idea. Plant the tallest plants on the north unless you want them to shade leafy green plants. And some leafy green plants, especially spinach and lettuce, for example, will bolt. They will form flowers and seeds, and then they get bitter and you can't eat them as soon as the weather gets hot. But if you can protect them, if you can shade them and keep that area cooler, they might have a longer lifespan in the garden. Now, on the right, you'll see what were called by Native Americans the Three Sisters. So the corn acts as a trellis. Corn is a very heavy feeder. That means it needs a lot of fertilizer. The beans are legumes. Legumes have roots that have tiny little nodules on them, and they're actually helping to enrich the soil, and the corn needs a lot of nutrients. And then the squash, which spread out over the soil, are wonderful because they shade the soil so they keep it more moist and cooler. So the Three Sisters are essentially using the characteristics of 3 different species to help each other. Some of you had questions initially about companion planting, and the companion planting of the Three Sisters is probably about as basic as you can get. But other plants, when you're planning your garden, you might want to plan ahead for this, help each other because of their size or shape, but other ones help by attracting beneficial pollinators or repelling, keeping other insects away that eat the crop. And the last thing that you want is insects eating your crop, and that's called trap cropping. There's a whole bunch of information in the publication that I've referred to about these. You also want to have a wide variety of shapes, smells, and colors, because insects will hone in on one specific species, and you can confuse them just by having so many choices for them. Again, the legumes, the peas, beans, and clover enrich the soil. Very few vegetable species hurt each other except for sunflower seeds or sunflowers that have been found to be, they retard some plants' growth. So you might want to keep the sunflowers out of your vegetable garden just in case. Now, again, many of you ask about getting a soil test. Native soil, the mostly clay that we find in our Western Oregon landscapes, is the typical medium here, but containers with and raised bed gardens may have topsoil or compost. You might want to get those tested. If you perceive that you're not having problems with them, that may not be something that you need to do. Although native soil west of the Cascades is usually acidic, and that's what most of our vegetable species prefer, you really won't know until it is tested. Now, you can buy inexpensive test kits. I will tell you that when they've compared these little test kits for pH and nutrients, and they've compared them with laboratory results, they're often not the same values. You can also get one of these really expensive little probes that will give you information about how much water is in the soil. And although I seem to have misplaced it, there is another 3-pronged probe that's fairly inexpensive that will give you information about the pH and the water in the soil. And again, they're not particularly accurate, but you might want to wait and see how your crop turns out before you spend money on a soil test. Just be sure that, and I've given you the link that you can find, and you can just Google this, Analytical Laboratories Serving Oregon, OSU, and come up with this publication. It'll give you a lot of information about soil testing. And just be sure that if you find that your soil is having, or your plants are having problems in your soil, that you make recommendations of the lab, and they can give you suggestions about how you can either change the pH, the acidity of the soil, or you can add nutrients appropriate to your specific crop or crops. Raised bed gardens are really great because and the reason that we love to curse clay is that it's often compacted. When it's dry, it's hard as a rock. When it's wet, you can sink up to your ankles. So raised bed gardens allow you to control what goes into your garden in terms of what's holding your plants there. And you can add topsoil, you can include humus, which isn't what's served with pita bread. It means a very healthy, balanced soil that's fluffy, much like the peat moss, and allows the water to go into the soil and provides nutrients to the plants. These are also great for customizing if you have any kind of disability, or you're getting to the age where you don't want to lean over for weeding or harvesting. I would suggest that the square garden on the right is probably not something, if it's as big as it looks like it is, it's going to be difficult to get into the center of that to do the weeding and harvesting and perhaps even the watering. So you want to think about the height of the raised bed and their placement so that you can easily get into them as you're working with your plants. And that is beautifully done in the one on the left. Some of you ask about how to plant plants on a slope. And you're going to want to think about raised beds in order to do that. But if you have any amount of water or slippage in the area, one thing that you might want to consider is using burlap bags. And you can often get them from some of the coffee shops around, the roasting coffee shops. And they're great to walk on. They prevent weeds, they hold water, they keep the soil cool, and you can walk on them safely. You can use these in any kind of a garden, but they've really proven to be a real boon for those of us in the Master Gardener Association. We actually distribute them to members that want them. Here are some ideas about some of the garden materials that you can use for raised beds. Cinder block used to be somewhat of a concern. It's not much of a concern anymore because it doesn't have cinder ash in it, so you can put vegetables in it safely. Galvanized steel is a very safe one. We used to have concerns about chemicals leaching from some of the wood, and the people used to use railroad ties for that, but the creosote has been banned by the EPA for several decades. But if you have any concerns about chemicals getting into your vegetable gardening, you can always put some of this 3 mil plastic and staple it so that it doesn't get into your vegetables. Now, there are other considerations. If you're using hanging containers, and when I say hanging, I mean ones that might either be hanging from a wall or they might be hanging from a patio cover. I mean, there are as many hanging containers as the mind can be concerned about, but will water drip on people or furniture? If you live in a multi-level housing environment and you're above the first floor, you might be worried about enraging the people below you because the water's going down into theirs. And there are actually restrictions in housing and agreements, leasing agreements that say you can't do that. Will the container with the plants in the potting medium and water be too heavy to move, especially if you want to go from an area that has more sun in the morning, move it to an area that has sun in the afternoon? If you have to bring in a crane to do that every day, you're probably not planning the right kind of containers. And will there be room between the beds to walk? Will the beds be narrow enough that you can comfortably get to the center of them, I mentioned in the previous one? And finally, can you keep the plants in enough sunlight so that they will, in fact, produce fruit? So when you're planting your garden, you have to think through essentially 2 or 3 seasons and how you're going to use that space comfortably to the benefit of your crops. Here are some other containers. The one thing to remember of any container is that it has to be well draining. You can go to a garden store and there are a lot of containers that should be used only for indoor plants, and then with some way for that water to drain off, whether it's a holder underneath it or whatever. But outside, putting them in containers that will drain well will prevent root rot, which is kind of an umbrella term for fungal and bacterial diseases in soils. You can always think outside the box. Some of you ask about the earth box, and as a master gardener, I'm unable to recommend one variety or another, but an earth box, and you can build these yourself, just has a tube that goes down and the water pools down here. Here's the soil and your plants grow up, and some of these are actually portable. But you can also use, these are eaves troughs that are on the side of a house. Again, they have to be well draining. There are actually ones that kind of go diagonally and the water goes down until it finally gets to the ground. And then if you have some old jeans that you don't have a purpose for, you can always entertain your neighbors by growing your vegetables outdoors in those. They are air and water permeable, so you probably don't have to worry about drainage. A couple of you asked about growing strawberries, and if there's a quintessential berry that people like, I suggest that this is probably the one for the Northwest, and here are just some various containers. But here's the publication that tells you all about strawberries. I could spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about berry plants, and we don't have time for that. Water is very important. There are 3 basic ways. You can carry out the old watering can, which is labor intensive, but you can water directly on the plant. And I suggest to you that when you're watering, do not water on the leaves. Here's the kind of back and forth watering thing that probably most of our parents use, but it's wasteful because about 40 to 60% of that, depending upon what time of the day you're watering, is evaporating. And what you're doing is creating little petri dishes on the leaves of your plants, which is where the fungi often grow. And it's hard to time them in order to control that evaporation on the plants. Finally, the drip systems, especially if they have some kind of a timer to them, will get the water down near the roots, which is where they're needed. Watering plants on the leaves is a waste of water and it's dangerous. But you can get it down there. You can put mulch over it if you want to, but you don't have to if you think about watering anywhere between 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. You don't want water to sit on leaves of any kind of plants overnight because the cool and the water are a great environment for all kinds of fungi. You probably are worried about fertilization. Well, the key is, do I see anything on my plants that would indicate that I need to add fertilizer? And if they're yellowing, then you know it's time either to test it to see what nutrients it needs, or to try adding some balance, 10-10-10. Don't use water soluble fertilizers. The first rain will wash it right down into the aquifer. So use organic and time release fertilizers, and they're helpful for the plant and they last a longer time. Weeding is just a plant in the wrong place. You may not want the plant there because that's not where you wanted to put it, but please be careful that if you have weeds in your garden, the first chemical that you think of is elbow grease rather than turning to any kind of a dust or spray or powder for them, because you may be killing a lot of other plants and you could do harm to yourself as well. I'm only going to go through these really quickly because I don't have time to spend on them, but our insects in the Pacific Northwest are hopefully still plentiful. They fall into 3 groups. And before you go trying to kill insects that you're worried about and you haven't been able to identify, and I still have problems identifying a lot of the insects either that I'm presented with to identify as a master gardener or in my garden, but I don't seem to have a lot of them. But the good are the pollinators, which include bees, flies, butterflies, and moths. You can see those specific ones at the bottom of the slide. Here are more good insects that many people misidentify. The lady beetle, praying mantid, pretty mantis, lacewing. Take some time to look these up if you're interested so that you don't kill off the ones that are the most valuable to you. The parasitoids are actually insects that lay their eggs in or near the pupa or larva of other insects that are the quote unquote bad insects. And as the parasitoid insects, young develop, they devour the pupa or the larva of the quote unquote bad insects. The bad include tomato hornworms, cabbage worms, and corn earworms. And these are just little eating machines that are between their pupal and their fly away stage. This is just the stage where they're gearing up to go into a chrysalis, like a butterfly, for example, and to become beautiful, but maybe not so valuable insects. Here are the ugly ones, although I think this is just the cutest little face I've ever seen in the world. I'm sure you've all heard of and probably experienced the impact of slugs. Again, they're little eating machines. In a sense, they're valuable because they're eating up dead, but then they get into the live plants that we're trying to use for our own diets. I'm not going to, as I said, I can't go into that, but I would hope that you would take some time if you're going to be vegetable gardening to learn which ones you need to target to extinction and the ones that you absolutely have to have if you're going to have a healthy garden. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. The succession planting is, as I said earlier, using the same space to plant a succession of different species of vegetables. And the second concept here is rotation of your plants from year to year. Some plants attract either diseases or insects, and if you keep planting that crop in that area year after year after year, that container, you're probably going to, if you fail to learn from the past, you're bound to repeat it. So in order to think about how you're going to do this for next year, it's helpful to keep a diary just to show yourself what the plot was and what it contained last year so that you can find a different crop to put in next year. And these are the 4 general crop rotation families that every 4 years, they'll rotate through this space. And within that 3-year period in between, the diseases and the insects that attacked that species 4 years ago are probably no longer there. If you want to find reliable sources to research vegetable gardening or anything else within horticulture, use the search URL as site:/edu, which will take you to university resources, or site.gov, which obviously will take you to government. All of these are based upon research and science. So if you did a search for raised bed gardening, Oregon, site:/edu, this would be the URL. And here is the publication that would bring you the most up-to-date information that we have in Oregon. They're certainly not limited to Oregon, but we do have some rather unique things going on in the Pacific Northwest, which includes Washington and Idaho, that may be more relevant to you, including the kinds of insects and diseases that we have here. Finally, you can come back and see this, but here are some other resources. Gardening, some of you ask about how to help your kids learn about vegetable gardening. There are actually publications at the edu URL for children, persons with disabilities, seniors, and sensory gardening. There aren't a lot of vegetables in there, but actually putting different scented plants within your vegetable gardening may help to dissuade some, as I said, insects from coming there just because you might like it, but they don't. The one at the top of the list on that is marigolds. If you'd like to see a different presentation on basic vegetable gardening from a different master gardener, here is another PowerPoint. He comes at it a little differently than I do. We probably cover most of the same material, and it's all based on growing your own. And finally, here is a not exactly raised garden bed, but I thought it was so beautiful, as are the words of Audrey Hepburn. Whether you're talking about ornamental plants or vegetable gardens, it is true that we plant because it's nothing that we may gain anything from today, but tomorrow it may be what keeps us alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kris. That was a great presentation. If anyone has any questions, please put those in the chat. I'll also chime in here and say that the library has a number of books on vegetable gardening, flower gardening, and we're always happy to help you find those books if you need help, especially right now since the stacks are closed to browsing. We can always put stuff on hold for you. So yeah, we just have those resources available to you. Kris, earlier we had a question from somebody when you were talking about soil. Someone asked if horse manure worked, if horse manure was good for fertilizing your garden.
The answer is maybe. So manures are simply, as I explained with the red wrigglers, manures are simply organic material that's been processed by primarily bacteria in the digestive system of whatever animal spews it out the other end. One of the problems with using both cattle and horse manures is that they can tend to have too many salts in them. With horses, I had a friend who tried to use horse manure by including it in a worm composting bin, and the worms promptly died. And when we traced the problem back, it was because they'd used a dewormer on the horse because it had worms, the equivalent of worms, in its digestive system. So first of all, you have to trust that whoever you've gotten the manure from hasn't put some kind of chemicals in the feed or the medications or whatever that will be eliminated and then will become a part of your garden. You should never use any manure that is from an omnivore or a carnivore, an animal that eats either both vegetable material and other animals or just animals, so a true predator. That wouldn't be true of beef. It wouldn't be true, or cattle. It wouldn't be true of horses. It wouldn't be true of chickens. Now, when we get to that particular one, that's where the real problem comes, because um, uh, the four-legged animals, when they excrete, they have solid poop in one place and they have urine someplace else. I'm going to answer your question, but chickens, if you've ever seen chicken droppings, both the liquid and the solid are together in the same place. And urine is primarily nitrogen, so it's called hot. If you put unseasoned, non-decomposed chicken manure in your garden, there's too much nitrogen, it'll kill the roots of the plant. Thankfully, that's not the case for most of the cattle and horse manures. However, it is always best to let them compost for at least 6 months before you add them to your garden. Ideally, they would have been composted in a hot compost situation. This is especially true for chickens, because you want the internal temperature to reach somewhere at least 140 degrees to kill off parasites that find their way through these ruminants' digestive systems. And the last thing you want to do is to put those type of potentially really dangerous living entities into your garden, especially when you're going to be eating the food. So when you go to a garden store or a farmer's supply store, you want to look for seasoned manures. Again, especially with chicken. You can kill a crop faster by just using uncomposted, unmature chicken manure. I can't think of anything that would kill off a garden except for maybe a true chemical pesticide. And you can certainly compost these on your own property. You just want to make sure that they are turned and kept relatively moist. And the reason for doing that is that what is killing off the parasites that might be there and decomposing this primarily fiber that was passed through their system, what is doing the real work are microbes. And microbes are living, for example, bacteria or fungi, nematodes, etc. And because they're living just like us, they're in the animal kingdom, they need air and water. The reason for turning them, again, this is true of any type of organic material, including manures. The reason for turning them is that the bacteria, which are the front line and ones that the entity that there's the most of in that environment, fall into two categories for our purposes. There are the aerobic, that is air bacteria, and there are the anaerobic bacteria. Your skin is covered with aerobic bacteria. Your digestive system is full of anaerobic bacteria. If you've ever mown a lawn, put the clippings over in a pile, came back in 5-7 days, and you couldn't get very close to it because of the ammonia smell, that's primarily anaerobic bacteria. And the two things that bacteria exude are gas and acids. So what you're smelling is the gas part of the job that they're doing in their decomposition work. So by turning the pile and continuing to add water and introducing air by turning it, you're helping to create an ideal environment for the aerobic bacteria and reducing the amount of anaerobic bacteria that produce these gases and acids.
All right. Thank you, Kris. I'll address this quick question. Somebody asked about the library's seed library, which is, for those of you that don't know, the library has seeds you can, quote, check out and plant. And for now, that continues to remain suspended because the library is still mostly closed due to the pandemic. So hopefully we'll be able to bring that back at some point. So another question about fertilizer. Someone asked, is 16-16-16 fertilizer good?
The answer depends on what is your crop. The general rule, though, is that you're kind of going overboard and you're wasting nutrients if you go above 10-10-10. And let me explain the numbers from a different perspective. What they're telling you is that by weight, not volume, by weight, 16% of the contents of that fertilizer container, whether it's liquid or all of the ways that you can buy fertilizer, 16% is nitrogen, 16% is phosphorus, and 16% is potassium. That's overkill for most plants. And for the ones that have sensitive root systems, that concentrated an amount of nitrogen, much like the chicken manure, is unnecessary and it can be deleterious to your plants. So if you have a plant that you're not going to worry about the roots, like our root vegetables, you wouldn't need to give them so much phosphorus, certainly not 16%. For the plants that are producing fruits and vegetables, flowers, etc., you would want that number to be a little higher. You certainly don't want to go something like 16-4-4 for anything in the vegetable garden, unless it's just a leafy green, but it's probably going to be 4 feet tall and probably tough. So more is not necessarily better. And I would suggest that you use the information in the publication Growing Your Own about the amount of fertilizers and the concentration of fertilizers. Let me point out one other thing. We know that through the process of dissolving in one form or another, all of these nutrients end up in the aquifer and they eventually get carried into our rivers and streams. Too much nitrogen, either at 16-16-16 or 20-20-20, or to some extent, and depending upon the kind of soil that you have, even 10-10-10, can end up creating algae blooms as this nitrogen makes its way into the ocean. Now, you wouldn't think that you would need to care about that as a vegetable gardener, but you really should. The second part of the problem is that using excessive amounts of phosphorus the second one is typically unnecessary. And because phosphorus has to be mined, it is estimated that by the end of this century, we will be depleted, no more phosphorus available. So using more of something, first of all, doesn't help your plants and may be harmful to them, but secondarily, thinking a little wider, it's not helpful for the environment.
All right, thank you. Sorry, excuse me. Someone asked, for a beginner garden, do you have any general recommendations for low maintenance and easy to grow vegetables?
Yeah, I would, and I did when I first started. I just started off with the leafy vegetables like spinach and lettuce. And although we don't have time to get into this, but many of these easy vegetables are actually cool weather crops, and you can plant them in late summer or early fall, and you can continue to harvest them all winter. Kale is one of those that, I recommend for kids. Just they're wonderful varieties and they're pretty, and you don't have to worry about the heat and the lack of water in the summer, and you can watch them grow and you can mulch them, and they're really easy to learn. The ones that get the most problems, and B, the most intensive care are, and we didn't talk about this, but berries. They come down with every malady known to mankind, and they take a lot of pruning, and you have to test the soil and make sure the soil pH is correct, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say just start off with just the leafy vegetables. The next more leafy vegetables, and then some of the alliums. So for example, green onions and garlic. And I've had some garlic chives that have been producing, I think, for 5 years. And they're so herbs can be a great way for you to incorporate fresh tastes into your garden. And many of them are actually nutritionally very healthy. I'm looking at this picture right here and just thinking, what is it here that I would grow if I were starting all over again? The challenging ones tend to be the brassica family. That is the cabbages, Brussels sprouts, simply because most of the bad, quote unquote, insects that I pictured were the ones that munch on those the most. So it becomes challenging until you know pest control methods. It becomes challenging to get to the point where you think, plant, just go on your own. I don't have time to be looking under the leaves and watching the roots to make sure that they don't have insects at that level eating them. So start off small,
Can you suggest an organic way to prevent slugs?
Beer. Seriously, one way that you can attract slugs, and it's a timing issue, is to take a cottage cheese container, cut out about 6 square holes right below the rim, plant it in the ground with the holes about 1/2 inch above ground level, and put in beer, maybe an inch max. Slugs have a very acute sense of smell, even though you won't see noses on them. And at night, when they come out, they will very slowly find their way to, and they must smell the yeasty smell that comes off of beer. Even the tiny ones that won't even get into the beer, and they will die as they are crawling up across into the container. Now, if you don't want to waste some good, Bud Light, you can always just use some baking yeast, not brewer's yeast, but baking yeast, water and sugar, make a slurry out of it, and they will smell that same yeasty smell, and they'll come, and they're not drowning. They get, some of them, the larger ones, get right down in there. The other thing that you have to do, quite frankly, is to look for them in the fall, because the eggs are laid by the females in the fall, and they're in little clutches, and they tend to be on the undersides of some of the vegetables that I was just talking about, especially the cabbages, etc. And if you see just little clutches of them, they can be anywhere between 10 and 20, typically almost white eggs, then you need to make sure to, and this is in October, November, cut them off and destroy the babies, because you'll have fewer of them in the spring if you take care to address the problem in the fall.
All right. That is all of our questions. So I want to give a big thank you to Kris for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. You're clearly very knowledgeable, as all the Master Gardeners are. We appreciate you taking the time to share vegetable gardening knowledge tonight. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you, Kris.